There she is.
Lass es doch stehen, Mann. Mach das gleich. Lass es stehen.
Nee, ich habe es ja schon hier.
Mach das gleich. Ja, das ist deins.
ठीक है अभी ऐसे ठीक है थैंक यू
Hello. Singing, na?
लाउड मुझे सिंगे दो
That's all.
खुदो बहुत just लेर मुझे कुछ देर मुझे ऐसे कटिंग चेयर मुझे हमें कौन सा शुगा
Los. That sebu kuye na. Songjurki. Gishila.
No, 구두. Pamela 구두 니께 구두에. Pamela.
किसने यहाँ सिंगे
나세 뒤로 부시고지 슈루치 지르 주스 주발라 야나 캐런지 뒤지.
दीपक जी आप किसी लोग कुछ बोल रहे हैं आप सुनना नहीं कुछ चीज करना
알레 뉴샤 따유샤 킴.
Hello Aman can you check with Geshela if she can hear Rinpoche well
Okay.
yeah
구두.
good
Yeah.
yeah वो सिंगे तो सुन मुझे ऐसे yeah welcome back all to the 5th weekend thank you so much all for coming back Rinpoche thank you so much for the precious teaching for accepting the precious to teach for us so let's begin with the short mandala we can start with okay sa shi ge chung she me do jam re rab ling she yin de gen ba de sangye shin do me de wa yi du gun nam ta sing la chu ba sho may my venerable Lama's life be firm, his wide divine action spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of the teachings of Losang always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in the 3 realms. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalaya Dayani.
Sanje Judan Suji Chunanda, Shanjo Bardo Danicho, Lagi Chuji Jive Chunanje, Roba Binja Sanje, Roboro Shu, Sanje, Judan Suji Chunanda, Shanjo Bardo Danicho Sushi, Lagi Chuji Jive Chunanda, Roba Binja Sanje, Roboro Shu, Sanje, Judan Suji Chunanda, Shanjo Bardo Danicho, Lagi Chuji Jive Chunanje, Roba Binja Sanje, Roboro Shu. 아무나 이게 너무 이게 좀 나는 이게 나도 그냥 단계도 답이 주된도
So for those who listen to the Dharma, so what I would say is before, so at festival, for those who listen to the Dharma, it's the Madhyamika, it's a Madhyamika text we're studying, recognizing the mother. It's actually about realizing emptiness. So its main subject is emptiness. So when we talk about selflessness or emptiness, why are we talking about this? What's the purpose? What's the goal? Why do we need to understand emptiness? That's very clear. So we want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. That's the reason. So how do we become happy? What's the main cause? It's an understanding, a correct understanding of reality. It's wisdom, understanding. And where does suffering come from? So for the Saturdays, for instance, says that it's the self-grasping mind. It's the mind that grasps, the mind that doesn't know how the self really exists. So it doesn't see how the self exists. That's ignorance with regard to self-grasping. So it's just not knowing, just being dark, being in the dark about the existence. That's what the Satantrika says. But they're not diametrically opposed. They're not, according to them, it's not the mind that is diametrically opposed to reality. It's just this mind that's in the darkness. So that kind of ignorance, that kind of mental darkness, so not being able to see, kind of saying that's the root of samsara, that kind of ignorance, that's not okay. That's not, it doesn't have the function of actually, this mind doesn't grasp at the opposite of emptiness. So this kind of just mental darkness, that cannot be the root of samsara. That cannot be. So this ignorance of just darkness, according to the Satantrika, that's not okay, because we're looking for a self-grasping here, a mind that is diametrically opposed to reality. That's important to understand, so that this view of the Satantrika, this just non-understanding, cannot be the root ignorance. So when we talk about the root of samsara, it's a mind that's diametrically opposed to reality, that perceives the opposite of what's actually there. It perceives things in a way in which they don't exist. Therefore, if we understand emptiness, then we understand the emptiness, we understand the opposite of that mind. For instance, when we say, with regard to the pillar, so the pillar holding on to it inherently being inherently existent, when we understand it doesn't exist that way, then we realize exactly the opposite of that. Therefore, the root of all suffering is this ignorance, this self-grasping mind that's diametrically opposed to reality. And then we need to know, how does this happen? How does the self-grasping give rise to a mind that is not subdued? Now, also, what is the problem? What is the fault of the self-grasping mind? How does it give rise to other problems? So all this is extremely important. So really everything, when we talk about the Dharma, the most important aspect of the Dharma of Buddhism is really this, to understand the self-grasping mind. That is the root cause of samsara. It's responsible for all our suffering. That's what we need to understand. So saying, that's the Buddha himself, Buddha Shakyamuni himself has said that. He said that the self-grasping mind is the root cause. It's the root cause of all our trouble. But before the Buddha came, there were other systems that talked about the afflictive emotions, such as anger, attachment, that they are the root of all our sufferings. They recognize that. But the actual root of all our problem, that was not recognized by these non-Buddhist systems previous to the Buddha. Therefore, it's important to understand this, that self-grasping is the root of everything. When we think about the 12 links of dependent arising, when we think of the Four Noble Truths, everything is like, it comes down to self-grasping. That's the main condition, the main cause. So, and because we have self-grasping, that gives rise to attachment, aversion, and so forth. Then that gives rise to the accumulation of karma. We accumulate karma based on that, and then based on that, we take on the aggregates. We're reborn, or we take on the aggregates. That's got the same meaning. Now, when we're conceived at the time of conception, when you have the fertilized egg of the mother, when the consciousness connects to that, that's what we talk about. That's what we mean with rebirth, or like being conception, like being conceived. And it is that mind that is connected to the fertilized egg. Well, that mind, that continuum will become enlightened. And so we talk about here this continuum of the mental consciousness that goes on from one life to the next, and that then eventually becomes enlightened, and that it's free from a body in that way, or to this ordinary body. Therefore, having an ordinary body, that means we're not free from samsara. That's a problem. That's our problem. Our body has of course many. We're not saying that our mind doesn't have any good qualities, but that's not what's meant. But what the Buddha said is with regard to our body, this is actually, well, he says it's actually a precious body. He says it's a precious human body, this precious human life, or precious human aggregate. Why? Because in order to go beyond, if we want to go beyond, if we want to go to, for instance, the other shore of a sea or a lake, we need to take a boat. So likewise, our body is like a boat in order to go beyond samsara, or the ocean of samsara. Therefore, with this body, this human brain, we can think a lot, we can reflect on things. Therefore, it's important to have this body, and we are able to think of suffering, not just the suffering of this life, but also of the suffering that we experienced in past lives. We can reflect on it. Our brain is so amazing in that we can think about events that happened thousands of years ago. We can think about events that lie in the future. Therefore, in comparison to animals, we have our mind can become so profound, can become so extensive in terms of its thoughts. So we can use this mind and this body in a certain way. So for this life and for the future, in that in that we can remove suffering not just for a short time, but forever. And so in that way, that mind is so precious. If we can, whether we can attain liberation or not, that's to be analyzed. We need to check whether that's possible. Now, if we think about, so when we talk about rebirth, for instance, it all comes down to the mental consciousness, something that continues on from one life to the next. So we say that this mind connects to another mind, to another mind. Therefore, mental consciousness has no beginning, has no end. So since beginningless time, without any beginning, which is difficult to understand. But so we can't really posit. So if we said that it has a beginning, if we can't really understand that, we have to posit some beginning. But what would that beginning mean? What would that beginning of the mind mean? So we could only say that it comes from something physical. That's the only assertion we could have, that there's something physical, some physical entity, some particles that are coming together, and that based on that the mind has arisen. If we have a hard time accepting that the mind is beginningless, that's the only other option. So usually when we talk about like particles, atoms coming together, it's very difficult, very complicated situation. So how has this world come together? So how nowadays scientists, they talk about the Big Bang. Initially, you had the Big Bang, where everything came together. And then based on that, how did the world come together? So for many millions of years, thousands, millions of years, slowly this world came into being. This is how scientists would explain it. So, but the point is, the only thing what we could say is really that during the time of the Big Bang, the consciousness would have had to come in existence. That's unless it exists since beginning this time. But that would be very difficult because there are a lot of other things we can't explain. If we were to say that our mental consciousness has arisen from the physical, so our consciousness is an experiencing entity. It experiences, it perceives things. So that's different to physical objects. If really consciousness had come from, if its substantial cause were physical objects, then the same functions and qualities that you find with kind of enhancing and expanding and decrease and so forth, all these qualities, these functions of physical objects, they would have to be found with the mind, and that's just not the case. So nowadays neuroscientists, they talk about, what do they see that? So a person who's mentally, whose brain is in balance, this person has usually a very calm mind. So a lot of scientists talk about that, neuroscientists. So without talking about meditation and so forth, just a person who's really calm. This calmness, where does that come from? That comes from having a good heart. So they've come to this understanding, and that has a positive impact on the brain, that the brain is in a balanced kind of state when the person has a good heart, a peaceful mind. And also when meditating, when you mentally meditate, then the mind also, the effect of the mind, or the activity of the mind, in particular with like meditation on, for instance, the winds and so forth. So there's so many different types of meditation. So anyway, they have a positive effect on the mind, on the brain and on the body. So there are different kinds of meditation. And so that even sometimes when there's some brain damage, it's the mind that can actually fix this problem. So there are examples of that. Therefore, it's the mind that affects the brain. So the mind can actually benefit our brain, our body, our brain. So through certain mental activities, so that certain aspects in the brain that can change in a positive way. Rinpoche says, I don't know all the details how this works, but it's definitely the case that our mind can actually affect our brain in a positive way. It can enhance our brain. Therefore, actually psychologists and brain scientists, neuroscientists, they sometimes have different views on that, which one is responsible for which. But taking other examples, for instance, meditating on concentration, on samadhi, on the different types of samadhis or the different types of meditative concentrations. Some people, when they have these concentrations, they can remember past lives, they can remember what happened before. If really consciousness had its origin in something physical, you couldn't explain that, how a person can remember past and future lives, and can remember past lives and so forth. Therefore, it's because of deep concentrations that we can have this memory, so memory of a past life. Therefore, it cannot have, the mental consciousness cannot have come into existence, for instance, from this body. Therefore, we talk about mind. The mind has existed since the beginning of this time. Even this world has existed before. So there's a beginning. There's a beginning to this world, but there's another world before that. There was a time of like a time that's called like the great empty time. But then this world came into being. But even before that empty time, there was another world before that. In that way, there's no beginning to the physical world. We can't even cite a beginning to this physical world. And the same is true for the consciousness. So for the mind and the physical world have existed since beginning this time. Therefore, we can talk about no beginning, no first life, and no last life. So in terms of mind continuing on. We cannot say this was the fast life we've had. No, we've always existed. Our mind has always existed. We've always had suffering. That's really extensive. That's a very kind of extensive teaching, a very comprehensive teaching. So very hard to understand. So where does the suffering come from? And here we can only say it's self-grasping. Self-grasping gives rise to suffering. And I talked about this before, how self-grasping gives rise to the afflictive emotions and suffering. So what I've talked about, therefore, is that selflessness is the essence of Buddhism. Why? Because why in connection to understanding what is the root of suffering. So therefore, emptiness becomes so important, just because the root of all our trouble is self-grasping, is directly opposed to selflessness. That's why in Buddhism, it's considered to be so important. It's explained so extensively. So actually, it's like a knife. It's like a knife. So it's like, if you have a knife, you need a hand that actually can cut this, can use this knife. So we need concentration. We need concentration. Concentration is like the hand. Therefore, wisdom is like a knife, and concentration is like the hand that holds the knife. Therefore, here talk about actually a special insight, realizing emptiness that is combined with a deep level of concentration. So we need calm abiding, which is like this mental factor which holds the wisdom. And for that, like for instance, if you hold a knife, you need a very stable hand. So if your hand keeps moving, if you keep moving back and forth, then even if you have wisdom, the wisdom doesn't have the capacity to really be effective. Therefore, you need a stable hand. You need a hand that's strong. So this powerful hand, that's like concentration. So this kind of stable concentration, which is like the hand. But that's also not enough. You need more than just a hand and a knife. You need a person who's clear, who's got no physical problems. So the person needs to be healthy. Without a person having a physical ability, then the hand and the knife won't be effective. And for that, you need morality. Morality is like the person. What does morality do? It makes everything very clear. So there are different kinds of morality. Morality of a bodhisattva, of the pratimoksha vows, the tantric vows, of the bodhisattva vow, and so forth. So you have the different types of morality. Here, what does morality mean? It refers to body, speech, and mind, of like holding or subduing the mind in such a way that you don't do whatever you want. This you can do, this you cannot do. So to kind of draw lines, to subdue the mind in that way, so that you don't engage in all sorts of actions of body, speech, and mind, harmful actions of body, speech, and mind. So for those who have no morality, no ethics, for sleeping or getting up or whatever, if you just do whatever you want, that would be not having morality, just doing whether it's good or bad, like having no control, drinking something, eating whatever you want, drinking whatever you want, if you just do whatever you want. So without being interested, just totally disinterested. So just kind of like whatever comes to mind, if you just do that, then with regard to body, speech, and mind, there's no ethics, there's no discipline. And if you have no discipline, how can you meditate on concentration? So you need some discipline to be actually to have concentration and wisdom. So therefore, that's the training, therefore, of morality. And once you have that, then you can train yourself in concentration and wisdom. This knife, that's the wisdom being held by a very stable hand, that's concentration, and that now you can cut through the misapprehension of reality. When we talk about suffering, therefore, in order to overcome suffering and to develop happiness, lasting happiness, or to generate lasting happiness, for that we need to overcome self-grasping. We need to understand that there's a wrong consciousness, and for that we need to realize selflessness. That's why we need selflessness. We need emptiness. Why do we talk about emptiness? Because we need to remove suffering. So this was just the introductory kind of teaching to start with these teachings, but we'll continue with the text, recognizing my mother in general. So if we talk about in general, so in general, it talks about the Madhyamika view. So Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, he composed this text. So at that time, when he composed it, he was, with regard to his own understanding of the middle way. So how did he set it forth? How did he explain it? What does it mean? How did he go about it? What is the essence of the middle way view? And so explaining, there are many different explanations. So what are the correct explanations? So explain what is most important of the different kinds of explanations with regard to the four tenet systems. How did they explain the middle way? And then also the four traditions, the 4 or 5 Tibetan traditions, how did they set forth the middle way view? So if this middle way view of the explanation, if you explain it this way, then it will be, you won't, if you explain it in a kind of in a certain way, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says, then you won't find emptiness, you won't realize emptiness. So for instance, just a sec, what she says. So for someone who meditates on emptiness, or someone who studies and reflects on it, so when we talk about selflessness, so here what is to refute? It's the self, it's true existence. So if we believe this means something else, so when we say, so without actually getting closer to our self-grasping, a sense that there's this other kind of object of negation, also with regard to the things around us, the objects around us. So we have self-grasping, and then from that, self-centeredness, and that gives rise to the other afflictive emotions. If we don't pay any attention to that, and instead think of some kind of external, some dangerous kind of object to be negated. So this is what self-grasping is. This is what self-cherish. So as if we were to create it just by our own mind, that's not the right way. So we need to hold on to the self-grasping, and there's some Gelugpa scholars, and here Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says here we need to be careful that there are these beings that they have this problem that they don't really address the object of negation of emptiness. So they move away from the actual middle way view if they don't address the way we perceive the self and so forth. So we need to really address this misapprehension that we have, this sense of I, and I look at that. And many Tibetan lamas, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, for instance, he says in his texts, when we say selflessness, when we talk about selflessness, we need to check whether the I exists inherently or not. Is it somewhere between the aggregates? So if we don't find anything, so if we don't find a self among the aggregates, that's just for a beginner. So for a beginner, there's a sense there is no I, there's fear, and that fear needs to be there. A beginner needs to have this kind of fear of losing the self. That's a good sign. So there's no I cannot find it. There's no inherent I among the aggregates. I cannot find anything. So among the body, among the consciousness, none of the aggregates hold an I. So there's no body, there's no real consciousness, nothing can be found there. So nothing exists in and of itself, out of itself. So if you were to, when you take apart the body, you can't find an I, and you can't find an inherently existent I. And there's a sense that I will disappear, and that will give rise to fear, and that fear should definitely be there. You need to have that fear. Definitely, certainly have that fear. So therefore, for us initially, it seems almost the same, almost this like almost 15-60% like the same, not the non-existence of the I and the non-inherent existence of the I. That seems to, for us initially, the same. Therefore, to understand selflessness, in order to understand how the I exists, so selflessness, emptiness. So we need to check, how does the mind perceive the I? What is the self-grasping we have ourselves? It's important to check this out. So in our own continuum, if we just ignore our own self-grasping and instead think there's some other kind of object of grasping, object of negation, of emptiness, well, that's useless. Then searching for that object of negation, of emptiness, is useless. And likewise in the other schools, in the other philosophical, in the other traditions, for instance, there are other scholars, for instance, in the Sakya school, they talk about the view of the mind being empty and clear. So, and having no apprehension, having no subject free, or not apprehending anything. So this non-apprehending anything, so nothing existing in and of itself. So that nothing, the mind doesn't apprehend anything, that there's nothing there. So actually that phenomena don't exist in and of themselves, but that you also don't apprehend anything. So this needs to be understood. That needs to be understood. If we don't understand this correctly, this kind of, if we don't understand what's really meant by the Sakya explanation, then we will just focus on nothingness. And so there's no apprehension of that, there's no apprehending of anything, that there's danger that this happens, that we misunderstand what's really meant with this here, that it actually just means that things don't exist in and of themselves. But instead, if we believe nothing is there, then we can make that mistake. Or also with the Kagya tradition, the Mahamudra tradition. So again, not apprehending anything, not differentiating between this, that, and the other. She says, I think I gave a quote yesterday on exactly that. So anyway, the way it's set forth in the Kagyu tradition, so that again, not to follow the thoughts in our mind, but rather to just remain in this spontaneous state, this uncontrived state. That's the meditation one should do. Whatever we see, whatever we perceive, we shouldn't follow after that. So again, just to be in that innate state, in that innate nature, or uncontrived nature. So that's here Changkya is saying, well, does that become the same as the Chinese Hashang's view of not holding on to anything? This needs to be, we need to be careful of that. And so the Nyingma tradition also, as I talked about it before, Rinpoche says, so the mind doesn't exist inherently, and also we forgot, and the mind, the objects, so objects being clear and not being clear and empty. So in that sense, that phenomena are empty, and within this emptiness, they're clear. So while they're clear, they're also empty. And so this really means being subject free, being free from apprehending anything. And that needs to be understood. And if we just believe this, there's the danger that we believe this refers to nothingness. And Changkya also talked about how he himself found the view based on Nagarjuna, based on Chandrakirti and Lama Tsongkhapa. He was able to find the view of, he discovered the view of emptiness. And so he talks about this in this text. That's really the main subject matter of recognizing my mother, if you were to summarize it. So this is just a course, or kind of a rough overview of what the view this text is all about. And so how should we meditate now on the view of emptiness? So since this text is on emptiness, is on the middle way view, the middle way, and there are many different ways to meditate on it. So for today, just to briefly, if just whatever comes to mind, I will explain to you. So first, so you need to it's important to recognize what's the object of negation. What is it that you need to negate? So if we don't recognize the object of negation, then we don't know what we should negate. What is it that we should negate? So if we don't know this should be negated, then either we negate everything or not enough. So we may actually negate emptiness, conventional phenomena. We may just negate all of those as well. That's the problem. If we negate everything, if we believe there's nothing there, well, we don't exist, then there's really nothing there. So we can't talk about this exists and this doesn't exist. We don't need to distinguish in that way. If nothing exists, then there's also no suffering. Then why would we work hard? If we have no problems, there's nothing. Why do we need to work towards eliminating our problems? If we say nothing is there, if we eliminate everything, well, negate everything, that doesn't work. So that's important to understand the object of negation in order not to negate too much. Or if we don't negate it, another problem would be that when we negate an object, we don't really know what to negate, and then we don't negate enough. So there's the danger. On the other hand, we don't negate too much, as in like we don't really recognize this is what we should negate, and we don't recognize that, and we just negate something that is just not enough. I mean, we negate not everything that we need to negate. So we fall either in the extreme, therefore, of nihilism, when we negate everything, or not enough, we fall into the extreme of verification or permanence. Therefore, if we don't really understand, therefore, if we don't understand, therefore, she says it again, the object of negation, we fall into extreme of nihilism if we negate everything, or we don't negate enough, and we fall into extreme of reification. So she just repeated that. Therefore, there's danger we fall into one of those two extremes, and it's very important to recognize what is the object of negation. For instance, if you want to catch a thief, for instance, we need to recognize the thief. So we have a sense, like some kind of generic image, some idea what the thief looks like. So in order to be able to catch the thief. So what has he stolen? How often has he stolen something? So where does he come? Does he come from the south, from the north? Where is he coming from? We need to clearly understand more about this thief. So without that, we need to catch a thief. So what kind of thief? What does he steal? If we don't know any of that, we just have just the thief. We may just, who are we going to catch? We have no idea what the thief is. Therefore, to catch a thief, it's important to understand what this thief is exactly. We need to recognize, we need to identify this thief. That's important. So that's one example that's usually given. Also another script. So for instance, if we say in a particular place, is there a vase or not? Before we can determine that, we need to understand what a vase is. So without knowing a vase, we can't determine in that place is there a vase or not. We can't talk about it. Therefore, it's so important to recognize the object of negation. And how do we do that? So when we have a mind that thinks I, that mind, this is I, this is me, this is the self. So first, I, the sense of I. So how is it apprehended? How do I apprehend this I? What is that I apprehend? So to understand the way it's apprehended and what is apprehended, that I, how does it appear? How does it appear to my mind? That we need to recognize. That's important, to recognize exactly that I, that self. So what is that I that appears? The one that we apprehend. So we talk about two types. There's a coarser and a subtler type. So there's first the self-sufficient, substantially existent I, and then there's the subtler I that is the inherently existent, the objectively existent I. So there's two different misapprehended I's or selves that are described in the texts. So when we talk about then, so the one that is recognized by the non-Buddhist system, that we don't have naturally, innately. So the permanent partners and so forth, that we don't need to talk about. But usually, actually, we do talk about that such a permanent partners independent self doesn't exist. So that's really on the basis of such a non-existent I, like there's no permanent partners independent I. And then there's the mind that there's the apprehension of this self existing as a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. That needs to be negated. And then even subtler than that, an I that exists inherently, that needs to be negated. So if we talk about this different types of misapprehended I, so in our mind, so with regard to the first type, when we think I, for us, it doesn't seem like the I is just imputed. Actually, so for instance, it doesn't seem like, oh, like in a dream, for instance, in a dream, a house appears to us, but it doesn't seem our I is just like that. So our I consciousness, for instance, if it sees something like, for instance, a white seeing a yellow snow mountain mistakenly, so we have a sense, we know actually that's just an appearance to the mind. So the color yellow, so seeing the color yellow, we actually know that this is just an appearance, that because of a certain eye problem that we see the white snowman as yellow. Well, we know that's not true. But for us, it's not the same with the eye. We don't know that the eye is just labeled. We're not aware of that. It seems the I really exists in and of itself. It exists objectively. It's really inherently there, not just labeled, but there's, so actually we have the thought I on the basis of the aggregates, mind and body. On the basis of mind and body, we believe that there's an I, we label I. But it seems there's something more than that, not just a labeled I. When we think I, it seems there's something there. There's really something from the side of the object, from the side of mind and body. There's really something there. So that's this appearance. Based on that appearance, that is the appearance of an inherent I. So when we think there's something there, that the I is not just labeled, that there's really something there. So as if among the aggregates, the I, it's not just labeled, there's really something inherent there. That's the sense, that's the mind that apprehends an inherently existent I. Then the coarser, how does the coarser mind perceive this I? So when there's a sense of an I that is not just labeled as if it exists among its body and mind, like as if inherent, this I, how does this I appear? As if it was that which controls the mind and body. So as if mind and body were that which is controlled. So as if the mind was like a king, was like a manager of mind and body. That's how it appears. So the controller and in that sense that the I is kind of the control of mind and body, and that the aggregates depend on the I. Such a sense of us. So this is how it appears to the mind, to our mind, that the I is that which controls. So this inherent I, it controls the body and mind, it controls the aggregates, and that body and mind is that which is being controlled. And not just that, also that which is controlled, the aggregates are dependent on the controller, which is the I. Not that the I is dependent on the aggregates, but the other way around. It seems to the mind the other way around. So for instance, the servants are dependent on a king, for instance, or a landlord. But it seems like the landlord is not dependent on the servants, but so the landlord can do whatever he wants. So that kind of sense, the I is really totally in charge. That's how the I appears to our mind. So it's based on that view that there's an inherently existent I. This sense of like the I is the controller of the aggregates, and not just that the aggregates are also dependent on the I, and that the I is not dependent on the aggregates. So that mind, the mind that perceives such a self, that is the mind that perceives a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. And this apprehending mind, or that mind that apprehends such a self. So it says also in the second chapter of the Pramanavartika, so we also have that innately, if we can check that we have that innate sense, so that there is like this I that is in charge, this I that is responsible, that's kind of like a landlord. And so it looks after the mind and body. It's that which controls them, and we don't realize that actually the I is also dependent on the aggregates. No, it doesn't seem that way. So if we watch our own mind, we become aware that we have that innate sense of an I. So when we think I, when there's this innate sense of an I, how does it appear to the mind? So when we have that apprehending awareness, so how do I perceive, for instance, in the case of subtle self-grasping, how does the I appear? How is it apprehended? Or coarse self-grasping, how does it appear? How do I apprehend it? This is understanding that is part of that. That's what we mean when we talk about identifying the object of negation. So from the point of view of the subtle self-grasping, there seems to be an I that is kind of not just labeled by the mind, but it's really there within the body and mind. It's part of the aggregates, or exists within the aggregates. With regard to the coarse self-grasping, there seems to be an I that's not dependent. So we believe there's a sense of an I that's not dependent, like it's self-sufficiently existent, or it controls mind and body without having to depend on them. So such an I, and that appears to the mind, that is the coarser type of self-grasping. That's what we describe as the coarse self-grasping. So when we understand that, we get closer to the object of negation. So to understand, and so for instance, when we have fear, it arises strongly. When we have great fear, or when we're really, really happy, when we have great happiness, then there's a strong sense of self-grasping. So at that time, we should analyze, how does it appear to me? How do I apprehend my I in that moment? That's when we can really identify it well. That's how it is explained in the scriptures. So that's one method. But so as Holiness also talks about it, when we don't need this necessarily, as Holiness says. So even right now, whatever we see, it seems that those objects around us exist inherently. So from that, we can already know that how phenomena appear. And that's really important, this explanation. In that way, we should understand that inherent existence or objective existence, that's the object of negation. And then also understanding the privation. Now, understanding if such a self existed, we need to know either it's one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates. Actually, whatever exists has to be one or different. So there's no other option. So either whatever exists, either it is one with the body or it's different from the body. Therefore, since everything that exists is either one or different, so therefore we need to also set forth this kind of pervasion. And then the next would be to identify, what does it mean not to be one with the aggregates? If my I were the one with the aggregates, then this I, so like she says, as you understand, therefore, if the I were to exist inherently, it has to be either one with the aggregates or different. So she just repeats that the I is not one with the aggregates. Why is it not one with the aggregates? So this is what it says in the text. So Rinpoche, just to say it again, so Rinpoche says, if something exists inherently, it's either inherently one with the aggregates or inherently different from the aggregates. There's no other option. So if it was one with the aggregates, if the I were one with the aggregates, this is the problem. The following Rinpoche will explain what is the fault of asserting that. So Rinpoche also spoke about this pervasion, that once you recognize the object to be negated, then you have to attain certainty with regard to the pervasion, which means it's either one with its parts, that is the aggregates, one with its parts, or different from its parts. And if it were one with its part, the following, Rinpoche will explain this now, the following problem will arise. So anyway, Rinpoche, you couldn't find it, never mind. So when we say that this inherent I, if there were such an inherent I, if it were one, actually it's not one with the aggregates. That's for sure. Why is it not one with the aggregates? If it were, hypothetically, if the inherently existent I were one with the aggregates, we have 5 aggregates. We have the physical aggregate, we have the mental aggregates, the feeling, and so forth. And there's so many different, well, when we have the mental aggregate, we can divide it into the formative aggregate. We can talk about the aggregate of feeling and so forth. Therefore, we have these 5 aggregates that can also be, well, you can kind of more expensively kind of divide them, but you can also talk about mind and body. But if the I were the 5 aggregates, is it all 5? If it's all 5, is it one aggregate? What is it if they were really one? So if the I, this inherent I, were all 5 aggregates, we would have 5 I's, 5 selves. So when you find the body, when you see the body, you would have to see the I. So whatever happens to any of the aggregates would happen to the I. So all that would have to be the case also for the I. So for instance, this I, if this I in this life, if the body in this life were to, so the body and mind of this life, when they stop, the I would become non-existent because they're exactly the same. So if the body is no longer the same, that I would be lost, because we've said it's exactly that. If it's one, then if any change happened to mind and body, then the I would be gone because they're exactly the same. So you no longer have that previous mind and body, so you no longer have the I. Therefore, with regard to the I, if the I were the same as mind and body, so we couldn't have, it's impossible to have rebirth. I mean, if for instance the body were the I, or the I were the body, you would be stuck with just the I, just with this body, and you couldn't have the body from a previous life or a next life. You couldn't have an I, previous lives I, and so forth. So there are a lot of kind of absurdities that would arise from this idea that the I were mind and body. And so she says, please switch on the light. Just switch on the light. There's the light. Someone is helping him to switch on the light. So in the Great Lam Room, for instance, by Lama Tsongkhapa, it said that if the aggregates are not the I. So what's the reason for that? If the I and the body were the self, then it would also stand in contradiction to the world, like we say, my body. So it seems like the I, which is like the owner. Conventionally, one is the I is the owner, and the rest and the body is that which is being owned. So the word I, the word self actually refers to an owner. So they have to actually be contradictory. You can't be. So this is one of the main reasons Lama Tsongkhapa says that according to conventions, that the I is the owner of mind and body. So we have a sense of I, an innate sense of I. So, but it doesn't refer that the I being the body. We don't have that sense. So we, therefore, saying the I is the body, the mind is the body, the I is the body, or the I is the mind. We don't have that innate sense, actually, in terms of the convention of the world. Actually, that's in contradiction to the sense of world, because there's really no sense of I, my body, I, my mind. So this innate sense, this innate conventional sense, it would be in contradiction to that. Therefore, also with regard, we can't say which one is the I. There's no sense on a conventional basis. So on a conventional level, there's a sense that neither my I is neither my body nor my mind. So scientists, when they look, for instance, at very subtle particles, so with a microscope, if they look, so it's very clear based on that the I is not the body. So it needs to be analyzed. The reason being that, so when we say the I is the body, so for instance, if you take a leaf of a tree, if you see this leaf of a tree, this green leaf, if you go on a very subtle level, if you see the cells of this green leaf, so when you kind of look closer, so there are different space, there's space in between. So for instance, it seems like there's a lot of space in between those different aspects. So and then you start to see the chromosomes in the cell. So within so it's like a long rope. So none of those are the actual leaves. So then if you go deeper and deeper, like you look closer and closer, you see the atoms. So you see DNA, first of all, so you first see the cells, then you see the DNA, which repeats that. And if you go closer, you see the atoms, you see the subtle particles. So whatever seemed so solid before you, so as a leaf, for instance, then if you look, you can't say what is the actual essence of this piece of, like this leaf. There's nothing solid there that can be called the leaf. So first you have the cells, then you have the DNA, you have the different molecules, you've got the atoms and so forth. Therefore, you can go closer and closer and closer, but you don't find some essence. So with regard to when you talk particles and then the subatomic particles and so forth, quarks, etc. So in that way, lastly, there's nothing to say this exactly is the leaf. What do you have there in the end? So you have the subtlest kind of particles. So in Tibetan, it's called the what's he said, like he's talking about like a God particle. So scientists would talk about like a God particle, possibly like this subtlest kind of particle that they can identify it. Anyway, the point is that when we analyze, the point is there for whatever you call it, but it's clear, especially in quantum physics, that you need a consciousness in order to perceive something, in order to perceive these subtle particles. Or if you see this kind of leaf of a tree, this is true for this leaf, it's true for other phenomena. So that there's a connection between consciousness and the subtle particles that anything is made of. Therefore, this is what the Buddha said, that phenomena are merely labeled, that you need a mind to label it. So it's quite similar, this explanation from quantum physics on one hand, that you have these subtle particles that make up a leaf, and then the explanation that you find on the Buddhist point of view. But the point is that actually the leaf is not its parts. It's very clear because none of those parts are the leaf. So if you look at the microscope and you take it apart, there's nothing that can be pointed at to say the leaf is this part or that part. Therefore, we can also say this with regard to the eye. With regard to the eye, it's not the aggregates. The same reasoning can help us to understand that. And then the other extreme would be if the eye existed inherently, if it's not one with the aggregates, it can only be different. An inherent eye can only be different from its aggregates. So like a different entity. But usually, I mean, that means where they will be totally disconnected. Usually, if it was totally separate from mind and body, you would be able to find it separate from mind and body. You could remove mind and body and still be left with an eye. If the inherent eye were different from mind and body, that would mean it's in and of itself, they're different. They would be totally disconnected. Mind and body would be totally disconnected. So the eye would not be merely labeled. In that case, it would mean the eye exists in and of itself. And that would mean they're a totally different entity, a different disconnected, a different entity, in that you could put the aggregates on one side and the eye on the other side. You would be able to identify it clearly. Therefore, this inherent eye is neither one with the aggregates nor different from the aggregates. And if that's neither one nor different, then it can't exist, since everything that exists is either one or different. So one with its parts or different from its parts. But if you can't find that, then such an inherent eye is impossible. In that way, you find the non-inherent existence of the eye. If you do this analysis through understanding it's neither inherently one with its parts nor different from its part, because it couldn't exist any other way. So in that way, we can meditate on that. That's what I wanted to tell you. This is just, there's more explanation, of course. This is just a short explanation. I can't explain everything to you in a short time. We only have a short time here. So maybe I was able to clarify it a little bit to give you some better idea, but of course you need to go further and get further explanation for it to become clearer. Anyway, we go back, so we return to the actual text. So where did we get to yesterday? So what we already covered, I think we're verse 18. We finished verse 17. So with regard to emptiness, the object of negation. So as was explained before, it doesn't help if we misunderstand the object of negation as like being totally separate. This is not the way to recognize it. And also the other philosophical tenet systems, they've not identified emptiness, so they've identified a coarse selflessness. So for instance, the Chitta Mantra, they've not recognized selflessness, the subtlest level. And even the three Eastern masters like Shantarakshita and so forth, so these Svatantrika masters, they've also not found the subtlest view. Therefore, they've fallen short of recognizing the actual view of emptiness. And then with regard to the four traditions in Buddhist, in the Tibetan tradition, again, so it needs to be analyzed how the way that's described. Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says we need to be careful to understand it correctly. So anyway, when we talk about selflessness, we're not talking about, so the Prasangika school says that the self-sufficiency of essentially existent self, or the emptiness of that, that's just a core selflessness. But you have the subtle selflessness, which is the lack of an inherently existent self. So that's the subtlest selflessness. So we don't, unless we understand that the I doesn't exist truly, or it doesn't exist inherently, we will understand that. But we have this fear that the I doesn't exist, if it doesn't exist inherently, it can't exist at all. So that's why the Buddha taught other philosophical systems for those who had fear, who feared that the self becomes non-existent as if it doesn't exist inherently. So the Buddha taught other philosophical systems. For instance, in the Chittamatra school, he taught that phenomena exist inherently, that they exist substantially, especially the mind exists substantially, otherwise they wouldn't be able to understand it. Therefore, there are two kind of ultimate truth, if you like. So the subtlest particles, so the subtlest, so the non-existence of subtlest particles, that is also an ultimate truth according to the Chittamatra. And then the subtlest, so that from the point of view of particles, there's no smallest particles, and that from the point of view of time, that there's no subtlest moment of consciousness. Those are both ultimate truth according to the Chittamatra school. So there's no subtlest particle and there's no smallest moment in time. Those are two ultimate truth according to the Chittamatra. So in the Chittamatra school, they talk about impermanent phenomena. Impermanent phenomena are independent phenomena, referring to impermanent things. So whatever is impermanent, so they're substantially existent, they're inherently and independently existent. So impermanent phenomena are the main phenomena, the main phenomena. And those two, if you analyze these coarse phenomena, the subtlest level of these coarse phenomena, these impermanent phenomena, are partless particles and smallest moments in time. So that's the subtlest level, and those are denied. So that's like the basis. That's really the basis for anything someone else would assert. So in the Chittamatra school, they don't exist. Well, the subtlest kind of phenomena that do exist, that subtlest phenomena that do exist in the Chittamatra school, they have to exist in and of themselves. They have to exist inherently. And so according to the lower schools, like the Vaibhashika and so forth, they would say that there are partless particles and that they're shortest moments in time, and that everything impermanent is based on that. So that's what according to the Vaibhashika and the Sautrantika school, there are the subtlest particles, they're like partless particles, they're smallest moments in time, and their existence are the ultimate truth. They're the smallest building blocks of everything impermanent, and impermanent phenomena exist truly, they exist in and of themselves. But in the Chittamatra school, they say that they don't exist, they don't assert that, and they assert consciousness. They don't exist external phenomena, they only exist consciousness, and they also accept a reflexive awareness, which is a self-knowing kind of mind, because everything that exists has to have a mind that perceives it, and if mind itself exists, has to have a reflexive awareness that perceives the mind itself. So mind perceiving itself, that's the self-knower. And that way, that's very important in the Chittamatra school. It's very important to understand that there are an external phenomena and that there's only mind. Without it wouldn't work. It's impossible to posit the Chittamatra school. For instance, if you say there's a book, this notebook, well, how do you know the book is there? Because there's a mind perceiving it. So how do you know that this I consciousness exists? Well, it knows itself. It knows itself. So in the sense that in the Chittamatra school, the existence of something is determined by the mind. So how do you determine the existence of the mind itself? By the mind itself. The mind has to know itself, and that's the self-knower. So there's always a mind that establishes the existence of something, which is okay with regard to colors and shapes and so forth appearing to the mind. They're determined by the mind, but so the mind has to also be determined by itself. There needs to be a reflexive or self-knowing awareness. Otherwise, they can't posit the mind. They can't posit the existence of mind. Therefore, it's very important in the Chittamatra school to assert a self-knower, a reflexive consciousness. And all these phenomena, they still, and here, so the text, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says that, well, we don't assert the self-knower, we don't assert this, but we assert mind and an object. And then likewise, Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says that's verse 17. So you don't need to worry. The Svatantrika school doesn't need to worry because phenomena still, although they don't exist inherently, they exist in dependence. And then verse 18. So then it goes on. So this is what the Sakya school would say. The Sakya school would say that there's clarity and emptiness, and this can be upheld. Changkya says that we don't contradict that. So you don't need to worry that you don't need to worry in that phenomena. We do assert that clarity and emptiness can be upheld, as the Sakya school asserts, and likewise with regard to as I talked about, Kunda Rinpoche, who gave this quote with regard to the Nyingma tradition here. So just saying that the non-apprehending something, I talked about this like in connection to Kunda Rinpoche, that there's no apprehending of an object, but still he says like seeing something as good or bad. So if I don't have any apprehending of good or bad, so how can you then really find the Madhyamika view if there's none of that, like good or bad? So there's a doubt here. Therefore, he says here, though pure primordially good and bad are feasible. So you can conventionally talk about good and bad, even though phenomena are pure primordially, as in like from the letter Ka and so forth, as it's described in the Nyingma tradition. So that's verse 18. Rinpoche quickly read through. Therefore, and then again in the verse 19, it talks about like the innate nature, uncontrived, and so forth. That like Mahamudra refers to this innate sense of like this innate clear nature, like uncontrived kind of mind. So not perceiving any kind of aspect like form and so forth. So to stop that apprehension or this perception, to stop that perception. So without the thought, this needs to be done and this should not be done. All this should be put aside according to the Mahamudra system. So that's the uncontrived view. But here Changkya Rölpai Dorjé says, even with a contrived meditation, so for instance, as part of the different meditations, the tantric meditations that you find in the generation and completion stage. So with regard to the meditation on subtle winds and drops, So with the subtle winds entering this central channel, when you do that, so when the example clear light mind, for instance, arise, so even that's a contrived meditation. So instead of the meaning clear light, if you have the example clear light, where the clear, if all the winds have entered the central channel, and when the clear light mind has become active, but it's initially it's only the example clear light mind, and that's contrived, and even that contrived meditation, even that is still you can still gain the innate nature with this contrived meditation. So your elder meditators don't need to be persistent. And then there's also other philosophers or there's a tradition in Tibet where they say nothing is existent, nothing is non-existent, nothing is neither, and so forth. So they talk about everything is, they deny everything. So this is this system by Shang Tangsampa. They're saying nothing is there. There's no existence. There's no non-existence. There's neither. There's not both. There's not neither. Nothing is there. Nothing is there. They just keep negating this total annihilation. So Changkya here says you don't need to do that. You don't need to this absence of liberation of existence. We can still say that although phenomena ultimately don't exist, but they exist conventionally. Therefore, here Changkya Rölpai Dorjé is saying, well, this idea that there's nothing there, according to Shang Tangsampa, that's not okay. And then verse 20. So this may all have evolved from not knowing the proper use of conventions by some wanting an erudition and so forth. So it may just be like the different scriptures explaining it differently. So of course, what is set forth is correct in the scriptures, but it can be misunderstood. And he says that, so for instance, with regard to he's not saying that he's not respectful. He has respect towards them. It doesn't mean to be disrespectful. And please, if I've offended you, please forgive me. So he's just, so if someone may say, well, are you omniscient with regard to the view? If someone were to ask Changkya Rölpai Dorjé, and Changkya Rölpai Dorjé answers in verse 21, so I'm not among the omniscient, but I do have received teachings from the lamas, from these qualified lamas who go back to the Buddha himself, and then in particular Nagarjuna and Chantakirti and Ayadeva and so forth, Lama Tsongkhapa, these great masters. With their help, I studied their texts. So I studied these texts, their teachings. So in writing the well-bred horse of my ancestors' works, here so the well-bred horse here are the scriptures. So what one studied. So this wish to study. So there's the apprehension, the wish to study, and then the enthusiasm to do so. So the wish and the effort. So based on that, I was able to traverse the challenging passage through constant and dedicated striving. So even if there are problems on the road, I was able to overcome them. So I work hard, or I have the hope. I have this hope to be able to overcome all challenges, to overcome all problems through continuously. So with constant, dedicated striving, that's my hope, based on the horse of the great masters. So what does it mean, verse 22 now? How do I come to understand the view correctly? So you don't need to do much, he says here. Don't have to search far, it says here in verse 22, in order to understand the correct view. So to search here for the view, as a person searching for the view. So to search the view, so we can find the view within us. So what is the I, and so forth. So we don't need to look outside of ourselves. So it's not like we need to look somewhere else in a different place. So disconnected to oneself, as if there was some great being or something. That's not what we're talking about here, like the view being something outside of ourselves. That's not necessary to search, like externally search far away. That's verse 22. So in the commentaries here it says, so looking for this, the view, looking for the view of the middle way. Here with regard to the I, we look, again, we need to just check the I itself, the sense of the I we have ourselves. So in the first line, no search is required, but the seeker is the thought, sought. So never grasp at the true, or it is false. So there's no true existence, no inherent existence. So in that, phenomena do not exist the way they appear to us. So therefore, we should not grasp it. Conventional truth to phenomena to be true, that is ultimate truth, but because they're false. So because they don't exist in the way they appear. So that's what it says in the second line, never grasp at the true. So never grasp at the ordinary phenomena to be the ultimate truth. And then, so phenomena appear to exist inherently, but they don't exist that way. In actuality, they don't exist truly. Therefore, it's not okay to perceive them as true in like, well, truly existent, but also existing the way they appear. Whatever appears to us, it appears not to exist the way it appears. It doesn't exist the way it appears to us. So how does phenomena don't exist inherently, but they appear to us in that way? Then it says, yet shun not this falsity, for it is the truth. So do not refute the existence of conventional phenomena. So because when we say the phenomena don't exist inherently, it doesn't mean they don't exist at all. That's not the meaning of it. So they do exist, phenomena do exist. So although they lack inherent existence, they exist conventionally. Because they exist conventionally, they don't exist inherently. Why do they not exist inherently? Well, if they existed inherently, then it would mean they would exist totally independently and they would always exist. And so there are all these different extremes that would follow from the inherent existence. So it says, then it goes on to say in verse 23, though I may not see my mother directly, so I say emptiness, emptiness. When we study about emptiness, for instance, I use the word all the time, but we don't perceive it directly. So we may just be lost in the words with regard to, so they're actually very kind. So dependent arising, the father, or dependent arising conventional truth, and the mother, they're very kind. So I feel like I found my kind, long lost parents. So actually I've lost them in the sense that I didn't realize them. I found them now, but we may just, even when we study about emptiness, we may lose emptiness in that we don't apprehend it correctly. So it's very important to apprehend it correctly. So far I've been like that. I've neither felt in the past I didn't understand what emptiness was, and then I got confused with this terminology, but now I've found my long lost parents. That is emptiness and dependent arising. So based on the scriptures, the horse, the well-bred horse from Nagarjuna, so Nagarjuna and so forth. And so now really understood, as I say, if it was close to me, now the author says, I found emptiness, like something close to me. If they were right here beside me, it says. So having understood emptiness, and it's based on the great kindness in verse 24, it says the great kindness of Nagarjuna and his heirs, and great indeed is the kindness of Chandakirti and so forth. So Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita, Chandakirti and so forth, these heirs, so there's 5 of them. And then also Vasantara Lama Tsongkhapa for his great kindness, and his own guru, his own Gyawakya-san, and so forth, so his own root gurus or main lamas. So to repay that kindness, in order to repay the kindness of these great masters, Nagarjuna, Vasantara Lama Tsongkhapa, and so forth, I will honor my mother. It says in verse 24. So since they were so kind to me, in order to give back or to repay, so if someone does us, benefits us greatly, then to repay their kindness. So in that same way, in order to do so, I will find emptiness, and that is like the offering of one's own practice. We talk about like offering, making different offerings to a Lama, making offerings to a Lama, like physical objects, like giving like material objects, that's inferior. But the best kind of offering to a Lama is the practice of one's own practice. So this is what he does here in verse 24. So when we say emptiness is inexpressible, actually, well, we talked about this before. Of course, actually, we can talk about emptiness. We can speak about it. We talk about it. We discuss it. So when someone has understood emptiness, they can express it to another person. So in the sense, it seems it is expressible. So here it says in verse 25, this unborn, inexpressible, aging mother. But what does it mean? It's inexpressible. It means I cannot express it the way one has realized it directly. In that way, it cannot be expressed. So this is what it means here as an inexpressible. And it's very difficult to express, and it's difficult to conceive. That's why we say here inexpressible. It's just really difficult to explain it exactly the way we directly perceive it. So emptiness is like that in verse 25. So though the joyous celebration of all noble deeds and so forth. And she reads verse 25. And so here it goes through the awareness here, through the meeting of the young child awareness. And then it was about the noble deeds. Here the noble deeds are the bodhisattva deeds. So to bring happiness to all sentient beings. So to take on all the sufferings and to instead give all happiness. So in that way, I will take all sentient beings to enlightenment. So that's what it says in 25. And then last in 26, it's like he expresses ecstasy, he expresses joy. So having understood emptiness, kind of like here's like dancing. He's kind of performing a dance. In my eye, Rölpai Dorjé performed here and now a dance of ecstatic joy and so forth. So that's the last verse. This is verse 26. So that should be enough. And please, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask questions. So please.
How do I unmute? Okay. Just give me a second. Venerable Dharma, can I request you to end the language interpretation?
So it's ended.
Thank you. We have first question from Poon. Poon, can you ask your question, please?
Yes, sure. Thank you. My question today is that being aware of all phenomena are dependent arising. There is no self, there is no controller. When one plans or aspirates and then execute an action, take action, deciding, for instance, like deciding to study wisdom, is this not taken, controlled by oneself? Or would you say this is just karma, it's just dependent arising? That's one. Then how to distinguish being a controller and being controlled by karma? And lastly, is it possible to deposit a cause that is free from the previous karma? I repeat again. Yeah. From the previous karma. From the previous karma. Yes.
We can't hear you.
A new cause. Deposit a new cause. That is, yes.
We can't hear you, Gisela. You have to, I think, come out of language interpretation. Come to the main channel.
To do it because I've never done this
Okay.
before. It was always
Now,
okay.
now we can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay. Rinpoche, singing Lost Rinpoche, lost Bamba. Tanda, ajala condition di dire. Da chu tamche karsada. Tende chubata. Denjung do insan. Ane tangane yomare. Da kansarange tubu zeyuki da shimena. Da wong yuwa poya yomare. Wong yuwa po mena. Da soso chik nga lobchun chego. Nga chik toni ki kola lobchun chego sna ta chene. Soso wong yuwa po da wo marwe. Da soso wong yukin do marwe. Tiwa tambu dire. 아니 주원님한테 dire 아니 원 유치하다 원 유아포니기 예와 치수디 간데래 소소 예와 치고는 원 유아포디 가래 원 유치하디 가래 어디 간데서 예와 치투 그래서 다버도 단다 레다 지단 소소 레기 다 양 레기 원기 지양 원 유아 다 소소 칼로다 레 코나 원 유아포다 와임바다 아니 그 레디양 원 유치하 임바실라 딜라 간데서 예와치 투시 아니 담아들라 수수치라 칼로 차와치하실라 딱 개와 나마 딱 말에 나르기 레라 마더베 수수 차와치하시 여러베 수수 나르기 사샤베 레라 레나 마더베 수수 양 담다지 칼로 딱 차와치하 여러베 다 수수 레 따르 다 차와치하시 여러베 좋습니다.
기차기도 한국이 강사랑자 토비 제스 주고 요 말이스 강사 스미치 주고 요 말이스 강사디 도베 다정리스
No, see.
혼종어레스 강사
No,
뒤
see.
뒤주엔 송거래 나나시 강사 유버래 나 유버래 시진 송거래
No, see.
랑제 투베 제스 투바 요마레 강 랑제 투베 제스 투바 요마레 이나야 나 요래 나
맞아.
요 이딩가 나 잠부 요래 나 님바 요래
맞아.
야부제나 잠부 차그래 두자제나
맞아.
님바 차르고래 이 딘디기 낭샤디 니버드 샤고래 송거 디마샤나 자원이 요 다기 러버나신
No,
뭐 요마르시 시데와 이나니 강야 요마 강야면은 아주 계시에 보임도스 디
Yes.
그래서 공자 켄디 샤고 그래 공자 켄디 가레스 라운디가나 다장지 공부부 다장지 랑 다장지 다취 냥스네야 참모도 다장지 있어 유버리 다장이네 유버리 다장도 유버 샤세 다디 가레 가부 샤도 루르 나와 장리디 유버리 있어 거다 루르 나와 장이나 가숑마숑 차르고 말이스 루르 나와 장이나야 유버 샤투레스 디시고 단 디고 지제는 가서 다 추天当中其他有问题讲呢第一远的人这些家一定가서 낭장도 유버디 간데 샤고是敌人这些技巧아니 저한테는 지치 디 상수 간이스는 낭장的유버 간데 샤고 레세 디라 지 도바당 렌자당다 당예만이 도바 친구 유에 되버지 다디 레라부자 깔레 카슈 지단이 친비 송에 다마시 공부를 세게 나온로라 랑신지 두바 가지 강에 요마 랑신 두고 요마리 제니 요마리 세지니 바 제간 중에 가야디 도즈 레라워요 레스 가 우미다에 가사연 디니 도시 깔레 카슈디 갈서는 다장의 류 다장제디 요바리스 루르 난장레디 아니 요바리 요바이미 마세 디 제롱바리 디 제미롱바리 세진 다장라 자제기 낭샤 샤이슈와 세선 디 깔레 카부이 구 카슈오 디 송고라 디 딩아주 추된 니발라 산난 단도 추된 지하요로 디고라这些지제
No, 가르좀 시다.
라오
최대 니버들 타마딩이야 볼 고츠면서.
추된 니발 다장 루이 낭장
알레로스.
샤당당
맞았어.
유바 샤당당 다장 자지 간데스 테버레스 디고
나세.
면을 디송나
So, well, first of all, when we talk about phenomena being dependently arisen, like you started off your question talking about that. Well, we need to understand that phenomena are merely labeled by conceptual consciousness, by conception. So therefore, the person does exist. We just say the person doesn't exist self-sufficiently, independently, self-sufficiency, as a self-sufficient entity. But the self exists, there is I. We do talk about conventional good and bad, harmful and not harmful. So when a person engages in certain actions, like positive actions, we say it's good, the person's a good person. When they engage in negative actions, we say they're a bad person, a negative person. So in that sense, there is dependent arising. We're not saying there's nothing there. There's a person who's meditating. But of course, the meditator is merely labeled. That which the meditator meditates on is merely labeled. The act of meditation, the object of meditation, the Dharma, that is merely labeled. And because phenomena are merely labeled, they're merely designated, therefore they exist. But that's what's so difficult to say, the mere appearance of things. Well, mere appearance means not just anything. It doesn't mean just anything. No, it means that phenomena are mere appearances in that they exist. That means that because they're merely labeled, they're mere appearances, they exist. Therefore, it's important to first explain what does it mean to be a mere appearance, to be merely labeled, and then based on that, we raise questions. And it's so natural that we have this question, we have these doubts about this, because it's the most difficult aspect to understand. So as Lama Zopa has talked about it in his Illuminating the Intent, he has said that, well, not finding inherent existence is easier than, so realizing lack of inherent existence is easier than understanding that phenomena are merely labeled. That's harder. First, you understand the emptiness of phenomena, and then you realize that they're merely labeled. So based on the understanding of emptiness, then you understand that phenomena are possible. They're just labeled. They're conventionally there. Object, action, and the agent, action, and the object of the action, they do exist. And that's most difficult. So it's easier, Lama Tsongkhapa says, to first understand the emptiness of phenomena, then to understand their dependent arising, the fact that they're merely labeled on the subtlest level. That is harder. So Rinpoche said first to translate this, and Rinpoche will continue.
ngadi wan juo bu dang pungbu di wan juje yin ba gang shi ji la ani wan juje pungbu di yin ngalo su ra le yu ba wan juo bu ngadi pungbu le pa du nu go ba wo de ji nang go res
no se
do du na dire wan juje gi pungbu la du mu gu be wan juo bu gi ngaji da wan juje gi pungbu di wan juo bu ngai wan juje yinbo zang de ma se di le zu ra le yu ba do ju ne ji wu da ji ku se ji wu de yu bu yo ben de ben bu de yu bu yo na nga ra sun ji den gi nang lo le nang jun ge ji xie dang ji ga ru yo se na yu bu di gi ben bu le pa ra le ba ro ki le ga ga ji ne re mun ju song ji dang ba yin cha ma ben bu le du gu ji ji bu di le du gu ji na ji bu ku ran yu bu zu gang le ga ji ji da bu ji 자 양 주스 러브 이너 만 주스 러브 이너 아니 소쇼스 러브 이너 파 주스 러브 이너 참마 크기 전생지 당생지 고로 세상 디낭신지 왕주 나디 풍부 왕주제 임바 왕 조부 다부 임바 마세 풍부了파 미두바다 풍부了왕조부 인제 파 두바 메바다 풍부디 나이 왕주제 인자 아니 나로츠 두바 유바 对吧？我听得起来。现在第一，往脚步的主些大部碰不等，俺的碰不你不第一，即往脚步等，即往主些引不通往脏的马些，往主些的出啥来了？往脚步的怕往主些了，啥么来不？大不一往主些的脚步，大不是那我的人真吧？我的刚才人家都被在主播的人情绪第一，但第大不要嘛，那么上节别开始我说呢，풍부 di ngalo pu ra le jangs ngadi 풍부 le pa ra me le ba tubo me ba ta bu na de di ngadi 풍부 le tubo me ba za ni ma re is ngadi 풍부 le tubo me ba zang de ma se be ngas ni di 풍부 le da zang re 풍부 ngadi pa se so na sin ji 풍부 yan pa sha choi 풍부 ye pa sha du ji 풍부 ye pa sha du ji 풍부 ye pa lu ji su ji 풍부 de pa sha ba yin di zu pa se yu shu du 나싱이지 무신지 자원이 요 말이지 남보 상제바 참여시 거다 뭐 풍분가 세유 슈도 풍분가레 루스 풍분가 파비 아니 나싱이 단도 수도 마하랑지 두두진 디레다 세기 풍분가레 루스 나지 수된요요 말어 세상 나디 풍분가라 미튜버레세 단디 뒤주디 우마 텐주에 나 풍분을 튜버레세기 뒤주 참무지 손을 디다 카가 요다 lui da zang re se di kha ga re da dang da du se di je za pungbu la din ne ma sha gu re pungbu lu le sha ne nga lu le sha gu re pungbu lu de ma sha bra nga lu le sha yo ma re je zang nga lu de sha wa di pungbu lu de sha wa lu du ba re se gi din de gi du chu ji ma du chu chang mu di song yo ma re
Now, with regard to the second part of the first question you asked, so with regard to the I, of course, the I is the controller. Conventionally, it does control mind and body. Conventionally, we say the I is the owner of mind and body, in that the word I in Tibetan or self in Tibetan actually is the first syllable is the same as the word owner. When you say owner, dakpo in Tibetan, well, that is the word self. Therefore, conventionally, yes, the I, that it owns the conventionally existent aggregates. In that sense, that's totally the case. When we say there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent I, a sense of a controller here, there's more to it. It seems there's a sense that there's a controller that does not have to rely on the aggregates, right? There's a sense that there's a controller that does not have to rely on mind and body, whereas the mind and body, they have to rely on the controller. So the example that's usually given is that of a landlord or a landowner, anyone, you know, in a high position, basically, who's got certain people working below or working for this person. There's a sense that, well, this landowner, let's say the landowner and his subjects. So the landowner does not have to rely on his subjects. He can do whatever he wants. He can boss them around and tell them what to do, tell them to leave, etc. However, on the other hand, the subjects of that landowner or the people working for this landowner, so they have to very much depend on the landowner. They depend for their livelihood on this. So in a similar way here, there's the sense that the I does not depend on mind and body at all. It's only the mind and body. They have to depend on the I. And that is where the mistaken aspect comes in. So there is a sense like the I is totally independent in that it's not just labeled, doesn't seem to be just labeled on the 5 aggregates, but it seems to exist in such a way that if you were to eliminate mind and body, you would still have this separate I. However, that doesn't exist. So none of the Buddhist tenet holders, none of the Buddhist philosophical systems would assert such an I, that there is a self that exists separate from mind and body. Instead, it's dependent on mind and body. So the I exists in dependence on mind and body. It's labeled on the basis, it's designated on the basis of mind and body. So that's what's meant here with this kind of control.
somebody lady Ngaransula on Jobu Reseti, the Shuchine Quaja or leg wongi, les Zambuki, Gine Sambulatia, Langin Bewangi Gine Ability to go Tichane, on Jobu set in the Shechu in degrees in a less setting on Sulero. Lady Chow, switch ever and Chibobu and switch ever. Maran Lava, Maransu, les Zambuti Jotan, Zambudi Ajetan, Nimbati Jotan, and those Gine Sound Down Chechine. 타바드 단지 침이 살는데 딘두만두지 수수 라버리 수수기 레 장에 가르치에 맞게세 수수 투사 쪽 수수를 투데 디간라 수수기 싫어 비지다니 원주 오버스는 다부 조디 수수 차대고 그랬어.
Now, with regard to your third question about karma being like the controller or the controlled, how to distinguish between the two? Well, in a sense, you could say, oh, right, it seems like we're controlled by negative karma, we're controlled by positive karma, in the sense, our controller. But let's face it, in actuality, we are in control. We created the karma. Who created the karma? We ourselves did. So it's up to us. If we create certain karmic actions, so we are really the controller of karma, in that if we refrain from accumulating negative actions and instead accumulate positive actions, well, we can benefit from the positive states. It can take us to liberation and enlightenment. So it's really up to us. It totally depends on us. So in actuality, we are the controller. We control karma. 근데 다마들라 지금 좀시 수수 차와치아지 수수 레라 마레 레라 라마 레버지 다 수수 나 사샤베 레라 라마 레베양 차와치츠 여러베 다 수수 레라 마드베 지소 노
아니 요요 이페나 신들 싫어가 되네 수수 레버 베제 땅지 오 디다부디 제 고버지 통지제 레스드 종지 세드 제요 세드 타바도 단지 뭐 두에기 자오디 레라 라레버레 시지니 레긴 데부 메알 구디나 유명한 메레 디수스 자오종고 자오세버
So, and with regard to the very last part of your question, well, is there any activity you can engage in without the karma playing any role, as in like not being influenced by karma? And Rinpoche said, of course there is. I mean, applying your wisdom. Because if, for instance, you working towards attaining liberation and enlightenment, you're waiting for your karma to ripen, well, you can wait forever because it's not going to happen. Because the karma is samsaric karma that we've accumulated. So therefore, Rinpoche says you have to develop wisdom. And then with that wisdom, that will be an activity that's not the result of your karma. It's something that takes you out of samsara.
So in other words, it's very liberating to hear Rinpoche saying that we actually controls the karma. I always had the belief that, everything we do every day, we wake up, we are being under the control of karma, and I can't get out of it. It's difficult to get out of it. So that's why my question was saying that, can I deposit a cause that is free from my previous karma? So now Rinpoche has clearly explained that, yes, we can, so that's very, very liberating. Thank you so much, Rinpoche. Thank you.
Rinpoche 고생. 배마시 밴드 총선 그 가두이네 단다바도 가두이네 레디 소소 원 유어 포도워제 다 소소 가야 제요 말에 다단다 rinpoche 디시견을 되는 아 소소 원 유어 포래 딥트 밴드 쇼 총선 rinpoche 디시견을 되는 소소지 칼로다 샘 플레도 칼로 처와 소리쳐.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Next question.
Thank you both. Also, a basic question. Rinpoche mentioned for beginners, it's good to have fear when you're thinking about there's no self. But what do you do after that? You can't sit in that fear. What's the next step?
Ali, after the fear? Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't hear clearly. So
Yeah.
you're saying, what should you do after you had that fear? What's the next step?
He said having the fear is good.
Okay.
So what do you do after
Okay.
that?
That's it.
Thank you.
Okay. More condition did that. Tangi Rinpoche soina shin the susu tangbochila rangshingi mebadila yewacha ba insang thoma chi susu toni koma tetse ani susu jinangi tata nga la do re nyambe chi jinangi ra ta tang Rinpoche tangi soina shin ta di jinangi shenandi yona yagudu ta ina shenangi sab je dela karchar susu shenangi ra da nga la do re nyambe shenangi ra di jela karchar.
그디 신하디 운에 레요이나 안드르지 마타이네 수수 생기 띵이 상루지 땅그 요디 세브리 카자마인 봐 카자마 레버 주주 땅이 신 나로라 상두베 가수그래 휴저지니 상루지 땅그 요디도 다 세브로 강 신하디 나세 상루 땅지지니 다 마메버 찬두도 상도 신하디가라 오 야도 상루 니버지 땅지 나 매번 차고 말했지. 나 유버는 니버 장. 그건 된 거.
맞아요.
나 쟤는 니에요. 쟤는 매버디 매버 구출 말했어. 오늘 유버에서 유당 가랬어. 유버는 니번 쟁구리가 유버 주생 시켜 보시고. 유당이 가르쳐 오니까 나 쟤는 많이 장. 나 유버디 유미 같이 요 말씀하고 있는데 나랑 신지 매버 공지진이 같이 공부 있는 같이 취내 매버 있는 아니 나다 최세 탄이 되고 원매도 용되지다 다나시 나지부민도 나지부도 나르지 구도 난디 제구도세 진짜기 낭샤디 진짜기 탄이디 도도 매버 지도지 동반이로 공제된 야 람비거라 진짜기 낭샤디 뇌도 매버스구라 바산에서 뇌도 매버스 도도 매버를 왜 카타 원기 카타이 되는 아주 사시시버디 사시시버디랑 신지 매버 같이지 되는 법이 있는데 사시시버디 이나요 사시시버디 제나 니도 매버디 사시시버디 사부 여바다 디가라 라바샤는 아주 라바 친구래 니기 라바 친구에 디 아주 집에 두제 꼴고 말해 니기 라바 친구 여바디 집에 두제 꼴고 봐디 뇨기 추카타이 그래 뇨기 간데 카타이 무슨 라바디 미가나 미자라 다 통통시다 라바디 같이 미다 다 니르침바인 디츠지 라바 차부차인 거래 아니 미나를 주는 라바 친구 그래 그래서 미기 라바 친구 여바디 뇨에 추카타이 뇨에 카타 뇨기 추카타이
나세
쟤는 니도 매바디 뇨에 카타이 말이 맞소 문수 통투고 말이 무송기 뇨도 말이 집에 제네 zeno ni de meba di ribe ding la po yeba di noe ding la no gi ding la no ngun song gi ding la po yeba di no ngun song gi ding la po ka cha yu xie zang zene meba dang zene me jang nga su gi nang ya dang nga su gi non de di du de meba ji yong di gang la du de meba no wa de du de meba nang wa di du de meba ji yong go re 아니 쟤는 녀요 말시에서 쟤는 매바당 두드 매바 노니부디 송지 인자 낭동 송주 우스그래 낭동 송주
No, see. No. There's this noise in the back. I don't know where that's coming from. Some noise. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So Rinpoche's answer to your question is, well, actually this fear shows if you really take it deeper, it shows that you've developed a deep feeling within. So you've not just taken the words, but you've gone deeper. So that's actually seen as a good sign. And the next step from there would be then to think, well, first, if you've kind of reached that point of the non-findability and fear arises, and then to think, well, even though it cannot be found, that doesn't mean it's non-existent. And to take to mind how the self does exist. So yeah, it cannot be found, but nonetheless, it can't be found, but if you look at your own experience, I mean, from an experiential point of view, being happy, not being happy, wanting something, not wanting something, it's clear that there is a conventional I, that the I does exist. So in that sense, there is a way in which the I exists that is not in contradiction to the fact that inherently it cannot be found. So for instance, if you take your own experience, I mean, you can't deny, although if you take, for instance, fire, something that is hot, so the element of fire, it's hot and burning. Of course, inherently, you can't find hot and burning. You can't find a hot and burning from its own side inherently. But if you get closer, if your hand gets closer to that which is hot and burning, well, it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, and eventually you burn yourself. So here your experience will help you. Your experience that you can burn yourself, that, you know, your mental experiences, well, based on that, they do not contradict the fact that things don't exist inherently. So, but you need to take that to mind. You need to apply reasoning. It doesn't appear naturally to us that phenomena don't exist inherently. For that, you need to apply reasoning. But then based on that, to then understand that the I does exist on the other hand, as Rinpoche explained, so that it's merely appearing, it's from your experience, you have the appearance there, you experience this. And that experience, therefore, does not reverse, does not contradict emptiness. Okay, so in that way you can think along these lines, as Rinpoche just explained, and become aware of the mere appearance of phenomena. Marco, I think Marco's next.
Oh, is that to
Losun.
Marco, can we just quickly, we don't have much time left, so if it's a short question.
Okay, Marco.
Oh, Marco, you need to unmute. Okay.
Yes. I was not allowed to unmute.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Timely matter. Hi, Rinpoche.
Hello.
You said a couple of times, and we mentioned in the previous session, I believe, that emptiness needs to be realized so we can develop bodhicitta.
Mm-hmm.
So that,
okay.
Yeah, this is how I wrote down that needs to be realized so we can develop bodhicitta. So to me, it sounds and seems logical. In a sense, when the emptiness is realized, there is no self that would be insufficient, and therefore we can see the suffering of other beings, and there seems to be no obstacle, no aversion, and no attachment preventing us to help others, and therefore it seems that bodhicitta can arise spontaneously. Right. However, of course, we know that, for example, from the three principal aspects of the path, that the order of the realizations, bodhicitta and then emptiness.
Okay.
And so is this order an issue of levels in the sense of understanding bodhicitta of emptiness and then realizing bodhicitta of emptiness? Or is it something else that needs to be done, simultaneously? Thank you.
Kuran condition the dire. Kasange maramushi disonre that semki kiala, janju semki wala, toni togures, Nian Jakish team, Rumbushi de Sore, Ringa in the teen, Casa Toni Dola, Casa semki kiala, toni togures. Taina yang ko kete some dana, the Je Guya Suristu Karsna, Kete Toni Dona, the Suso Ranchins in Yundu Joe, and the Chakwa Kaloda, Chedan Lasso and Yundu John, and Deacons in a Susu Ninja Lasota. And Shenchen Zingelo Shukuru Dores. Did I want some nana that Koya Swish to Dana Chochila some dana, and a Jerum Shigi Namsun Nana, Tango changes some somewhat. Di Jella and the Tao somewhat. Di Tonea Kurimenda somewhat. The dear in a thick container.
This Shangju is saying, Jeva Tombani to Modern Dugo said, Ombu Nubi wants Jenny. 하장기 온분농부 리버베 시우야우용이 디수제디 샹주지 생주를 집어도 돈이도 모든 누구 그래서 말이 가르스라드는 그 샹주초도 생제스라며 샹주도 생제스고 샹주의 미유리다 미유디 샹주 친구디 띵배체네다 미유디는 줘야디 타지에디라 샹주초도 생제스고로 미유 샹주 친구디 샤네 딜라 신진 탄제 미유 샹주 친구디가 야 샤야기 체도 내가 수수라니 샹주 친구들 토버지 인함에 누디라 샹주 초도 신지 와서 되게 샤야디라 나 되게 당제 샤발라 신지 탄제 샹주 있어는 거기 체도 내가 라니 샹주 토버지 내가 선들 간다 내가라고 말해 신지 탄제 샹주 고반은 거기 체도 라니지 샹주 고반 토버지 있으면 우리가 토제 샹주의 무만진 버 엄분유부주기 당제 샤고 말해 미유 두사디 하만고 딜은 두긴 시진 당제 샤고 말해서 엄분유부주 디는 두사기 샹주 문송 샹주 문송 발라 샹주 세디라 샹주 세 샹세卷타다 세바卷是생기卷타다 세바 생기卷타다 세디 생기 땡기 차수 녀모 볼로 수가 디주리 다 디주 세발라 디주기 자와디 당센와 당센 세고 다 당센 세베 세바 요르 요말로 디가 다음에 만또 봐 당센 세베 세바디 하고예요 세상 분능부 시부지 리본능부 디주리디 샹주주도 생제발라 돈이 따오면 돈 주고 그래서 디지지 다야 공부 디장 너무 많이 봐 지당기 라냥는 지긴 지인바이나 샹주주의 생 제발로 돈이 두배 따오면 돈 주고 말해 돈이 두배 따오마도 나야 인종공 거의 님이공 랑딘의 거의 님이공 인종주의 지 엔다나신디 신진 탄제기 딘의 거의 님이공 니지 진부지네 딜러딘의 신진 탄제 주연군세 윤딩군딩기 산제기 구간 딘데지니 패치 유행이 패치를 유행이 버리에 상비 이주기 고진이 지진이 아니 디다비 산제 구간은 거버 지인이 있을 당제 샤야디 연구어래 그래서 디 공부뉴드기 체부지 송요래스
So actually with regard to the order of what comes first, well, there is an order where you have to realize emptiness first and then generate bodhicitta, but that is only true for a person who is described as very sharp-minded, of a person of great intelligence, who doesn't take on anything on faith. So this kind of person, before they can generate bodhicitta, they have to realize emptiness in the sense that this kind of person, well, what does it mean to have bodhicitta? Bodhicitta here is the wish to become enlightened, the mind of enlightenment. In Tibetan, the word Changchuk, enlightenment, or great enlightenment, well, that refers to the state of elimination of all faults. And what are these faults? These faults are afflictive emotions. And what is the root fault? Well, that is grasping at the self. That is the root cause. So first, the person needs to understand that it is possible to attain this kind of sharp-minded person. They need to know, is enlightenment possible? Is that state possible? So they need to understand, just faith is not enough. Understanding enlightenment is possible. Understanding what is enlightenment? The state free from all afflictive emotions. Free from afflictive emotion means free from the root of samsara, the root of afflictive emotions, which is self-grasping. Meaning they need to understand that the elimination of self-grasping is possible. How can you understand that? Well, to understand that that mind has no support in reality. In other words, that its object, inherent existence, doesn't exist. So you have to understand emptiness first to understand that enlightenment is possible. And so this person first they understand emptiness, and then they understand, oh, enlightenment is possible. Okay, then I wish for it for the benefit of all sentient beings. Otherwise, they won't go for it. But a person who's not of that caliber, who doesn't have that need to understand things first, who follows faith, well, this person may first, based on reflecting on the falls of samsara and so forth, generate renunciation, and then meditate on the suffering of other sentient beings, and then the sense, well, enlightenment is probably possible. So based on faith, it's possible. I guess it's possible. They generate the wish to become enlightened, and only once they have generated bodhicitta, then they realize emptiness.
Thank you.
Yes.
That's what I'm cutting to share.
That's all.
That's it.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank-
See you next week.
Next
Thank
week.
you. Next week.
Yes, sir. More.
Chambe Bawe Cheda Kemba Tang Kundo Sambu Tenya Teshinto Teda Kunge Jeso Dalobje Gyawa Tamje Rabdo Waisho.
Mende? Melody.
Mende?
Konda, melody. Konda.
What's Sashi Begi Chungshi Meto Tam De Ravling Shin Yinte Kembati Sangi Shindo Migde Piwai Dogu Namda Shingla Jebai Shu. May my Venerable Lama's life be firm, his white divine action spread in the 10 directions. May the torch of his teaching of Losang always remain, dispelling the darkness of all beings in 3 directions. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niyatayami. Chambe Bajadagim Batang Kundu Samvati Antishinto, Teta Kungicha Sotalabje Kyo, Teta Tamche Rapto, Kare Raveko Vichingam Sutana Devo Malishumi, Cherese Wantinzi Katoi, Shabesi De Pato Tengu.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Yes. See you next.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. See you all next week. Not next week, actually tomorrow for the review session at 4 p.m. Hidden Standard Time. Tushe Gishla.
Namaste. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Venerable Dharma, for hosting. Thank you, Elman. Thank you, Deepak. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.